Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to this session. Our moderator is Susan Dentzer. She's board chair for Research America and president and CEO of America's Physician Groups. She's joined by Dr. Robert Califf, who's the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. They're going to talk about Dr. Califf's vision for the future of FDA. Susan, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Tim and Rob. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Susan.
So, Rob, you're now in your second tour of duty as FDA Commissioner. As we all know, you've just passed the 6-month mark in your current tenure. You know, there's this old French saying, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. What's new and what's not so new about being back at FDA from your perspective?
Well, I'd say, the basic nuts and bolts are not so new. I think the agency over the course of decades has developed a way to get things done, and that's still working quite well from everything I can see. The biggest thing that's new is the amount of political pressure and strife is an order of magnitude higher than it was in my previous tenure. It's very noticeable. And of course, we're, I don't know, depending on what you think about what the president just said, we're, in a pandemic or in some phase of a pandemic now, which has had a tremendous effect on just everyday work of everyone, including at the FDA. Another thing that's not so new is there are a whole set of issues where the briefing I got in 2022 looked eerily similar to the briefing that I got in 2016. And these are mostly in the areas where we don't have societal agreement about what should be done, areas like cannabis and kratom, areas that are difficult for us to deal with. And then again, what's new is that the science is just moving at a breathtaking pace. The opportunity to make a difference has never been greater. And I just hope we can come up with the right regulatory strategies to help the mix of science and industry develop products that are going to meet the needs, because we're going to have different needs going into the future.
Those in greater political pressures that you mentioned, are those simply in step with the changes we've seen overall in our politics over the last few years, or do you think there have been specific issues unique to FDA that makes it all especially controversial?
To be clear, I don't think there's anything unique about the FDA here. This is just a manifestation of the times that we live in. But what's, unchanged about FDA is that many societal issues that get discussed in concept come to a head because the FDA has to make decisions, and the decisions have consequences in the real world. And so people who might, let's say, take a sort of academic approach to argument in other areas, when it comes to FDA, often it's very literal, because there's a lot at stake in making a specific decision.
Indeed. You mentioned the ongoing discussions about whether we are in or are now out of the COVID-19 pandemic. As we know, whatever we call it, we're still seeing about 400 average deaths a day in the United States. We've got millions of booster vaccines available now, tailored to the Omicron variants that are experiencing relatively low take-up. And we've got the fall and winter influenza season coming, with the possibility of more COVID variants on the way. What, from the standpoint of the FDA, what is the most urgent set of issues in all of that for the agency at this point?
Well, I'll just say what's the most painful, and I think pain often creates urgency. My career was made seeing patients in the clinic. I'm a cardiologist, being driven to develop the evidence. And then when you have a treatment that really works and saves lives, doing whatever you can to make sure it's used effectively. And here we have vaccines and updated boosters that for every round we've been through reduce your risk of death by 80 to 90% at least. And for those who are unlucky enough to get infected, if they're high risk, we have antivirals that have the same effect. Now, you don't have to be a brilliant mathematician to do the contingent probabilities and realize that almost no one should be dying from COVID if they simply got the free prevention with vaccines and treatments that are available. But for a whole variety of reasons, we've got only about 30 to 40% of Americans up to date on their latest vaccination. Now we've got a round in progress, and there's a lot at stake. I think regardless of your beliefs about science or anything else, if you want to spend time with your family over the upcoming holidays and be around for that, probably the single most important thing you can do is get updated on your vaccination. And for doctors and other clinicians, get up to date on the use of antivirals when your patients do get sick. And I want to throw in one other component that's been in the news the last couple of days, and I think appropriately so. If you're one of the 3% of Americans who have immunocompromise, you have an illness or a disease, get protected by prophylactic antibodies, which are readily available but heavily underused. So that to me is the name of the game. It's one thing to have a very complicated set of things that are hard to figure out and logistically difficult, but here we're talking about a vaccine and a pill that you take for 5 days that can save your life, and we're having trouble getting it done.
The vaccines are free, no cost to our population. They are widely available. What do we do? You're making a very impassioned and very important plea to people. Are we really up against a wall that cannot be penetrated now in terms of vaccine resistance or vaccine apathy, we could even call it?
Well, I don't think we can let anyone talk us into being anything but incredibly persistent in trying all avenues about this. And I sort of divide the population into 3, maybe 4 large groups. They're the people probably like you and like me, who, I've already gotten my up-to-date vaccine. I've gotten all the ones available. And there are a lot of people who are lined up ready to go to the pharmacy when the announcement came out. On the other end of the spectrum, we do have a large group of Americans who have never gotten any vaccination. And they, of course, are the very highest risk of dying or being in the hospital. They're harder to reach, and we're going to have to think of new strategies to help them. Then we've got people who are inclined to believe in vaccination, who do suffer from what you described. I think it's fair to call that apathy, where, we're tired of the pandemic. For the most part, people are doing okay. And so you figure, much like seatbelts in a car, it's probably unlikely to be me. But we need to do what we did with seatbelts and have people realize it's a small thing you can do. And if you're unlucky enough to be in a crash with a seatbelt, or unlucky enough to get infected with COVID, you'd want to be protected by that up-to-date vaccination. Then the 4th group is one, includes a lot of my relatives. I grew up in South Carolina and North Carolina. There's a, very identifiable group of people who are not apathetic. They're relatively anti-vaccine, but they may have already had some vaccination because they're not totally anti-vaccine. And we've got to reach those people. They're getting adverse signals through social media and other methods. We've got to overcome
that. Still a very tall order in almost every respect. So we know that there was an enormous series of successes in getting vaccines developed and approved, and drugs developed and approved in the pandemic. And of course, some of that has fed the suspicion about the vaccines in particular, but notwithstanding the great care that was taken in the clinical trials. What are the most important lessons that the FDA takes away from this experience that could be applied to the inevitable future pandemics that we are likely to experience?
Well, I'd say, the lessons that are very concrete and real is when we have a common objective, the collaboration across the regulatory system, the NIH, and the industry can be profound and can get things done at a much faster rate. It's also the case that when we focus our regulatory attention, we can move things faster and we can make decisions that probabilistically yield, a high probability of safe and effective products, even in cases where we don't do everything that would be done in normal circumstances. But we also learned that when we loosen the reins, diagnostic tests being a good example, just like everything in our world, when there's a chance to make money, sometimes people take shortcuts. And if you're not vigilant, people can be harmed by not having the regulators do the job that they need to do. I'd say there's a big lesson right now that many of us involved are hyper acutely aware of. We have to prepare for the next emergency ahead of time. It doesn't work to wait until it happens, because we did a lot of great things with the technologies and the development of vaccines, but we've lost 1 million Americans. And so, and the attention span tends to be short. We forget, we put it behind us, which is an easy thing to do. But unless we shore up our supplies and prepare for the next one, we're going to be in the same trouble again.
So what would be the most important step that you think the agency can take to keep up that level of alertness and readiness for the next pandemic?
But I really think it's less the agency per se as it is the agency as part of the family of federal entities that need to work together to be prepared. I mean, the preparedness is something that extends particularly into the HHS family, but also defense industries, et cetera. So this is all a probabilistic portfolio issue. It came up with monkeypox. We had supplies intended for smallpox that could be translated to monkeypox after some effort to sort of get things reconfigured. So we have a set of risks. We know what they are, and we have to allocate the resources that it takes to be ready. And that means we, have to work together to come up with consensus and then convince the Congress to put the money out in order to be prepared.
Well, speaking of resources, we're just days away from the expiration of the current Prescription Drug User Fee Act. Can you talk about what we might expect if Congress does not succeed in reauthorizing the act very soon?
Well, it's clear that if Congress doesn't reach agreement and pass a user fee bill, that we'll have to lay people off, and a large number of people at the FDA. Regardless of your views about how the FDA should be funded, the fact is a large part of our budget is based on user fees. And if we can't pay people to do the work they do, we have a fiduciary obligation to inform them ahead of time that they need to look for other employment. This would be devastating to the public health. I mean, imagine all the cures that are on the verge of coming through and all of the issues that have come up just in my last 6 months, where you got to have the FDA in there doing its job to keep us safe from bad things that happen. I mean, having said that, I'm very optimistic. I'm getting a lot of reassurance that it will get through. I mean, as everyone knows, this is also a time when laws can be changed to fix problems that have been identified beyond just the user fees. That is really where the tough issues are. And I can't go into details on that, but we're very anxious to hear how Congress comes to resolution.
With the drug user fees alone now accounting for about 75% of the budget of CDER, you have said in the past that philosophically, you would prefer that the taxpayers collectively were paying the entire freight for the FDA as opposed to having this user fee construct. Where do you think we are with respect to user fees? Is this the way FDA will be funded, at least to a large degree from here on out, or is there a possibility of moving past this current set of arrangements?
Well, I think for my foreseeable lifetime, I don't see it changing. I don't see an appetite of the American public to increase taxes for things like this. And I will note that the rigor and sort of operational efficiency that comes with user fees for part of what the FDA does, a review of applications, that actually does work really well. And I'll also note that the industry has come to the table with creative ideas about how to make the system better. So it's not all lost. It's just that in general, we're a public health agency, and I think the public, our customer is the public, not the industries. We need to work with the industries to, we're sort of like referees in a game where the industry is playing the game of developing products and we're enforcing the rules, but also means that we need to work with the industry to help them do the best job they can, in addition to being enforcers. Maybe community police is a better analogy. We need to be in the neighborhood. We also need to be able to give out the tickets and make the arrests when they're necessary. And so it's not all lost. It's just in general, I think, for public health, it would be best to keep it separated from the industry because our customer is the American public.
And so do you accept the criticism that the dice has been loaded too much in favor of industry and approvals and so forth as a consequence of the user fee programs?
No, I don't accept that. But I do accept the general issue that it's a tension that's always in play and needs to be dealt with, regardless of who paid. We'd have to be interacting a lot with the industry. I mean, can you imagine regulating gene editing without having people who understand the cutting edge of gene editing as it's applied, or designing clinical trials who've never done a clinical trial, given that industry funds the vast majority of clinical trials? So I don't accept that that the balance is inappropriate at this point. It's just a significant tension that would still be there. It would just be less of a tension if there were public funding of the entire agency. But we're given the situation that we have user fees. Let's make the best of it.
Great. Well, I'd like to close with a question for the many early career researchers who are in the audience today. Why did you choose public service? This is not your first rodeo, obviously, at FDA. I think it's your third, actually. And despite the difficulties that you've described, you keep returning to it. So what words of advice do you have for those who are considering a career in public service, and why should they, if they're not already considering it, why should people be thinking about it?
Well, the first time around, I grew up in the time of the Vietnam War. I didn't serve. I had a high draft number. I didn't particularly support that particular war as being a good thing necessarily, but I really saw the sacrifices that my classmates made. And I felt like in my whole career, I benefited greatly from public servants and the work that they did. If you haven't read Thomas Lewis's book about public service, you should definitely read it. And so I was really volunteering because it was a chance in my career to serve, and it turned out to be a great experience. But I didn't think I'd be coming back. And really the reason I came back is that the president called and said, will you do this? It's in the national interest. And I felt like we are in a very unusual time right now of a lot of loss of faith in public agencies and public service, in the institutions that have made this country great. So if I'm asked to serve in that capacity, I'll do it. And I would highly recommend for young people to look for a chance to do public service, even if that's not your career goal, because what you learn, I don't think can be learned anywhere else. it is amazing when your mission is the public health, the good of the American people. That is a very clear mission. That's a North Star to look to. So, so do it if you get a chance, and look for the chance to do it, even if you're going to do something else for the rest of your career.
Well, Rob, we are all humbled and grateful and honored for your public service. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, and have a good day.
You too.
Thank you, Susan and Commissioner Califf. I know there is so much more that we could go into, but I just want to say thank you for this great conversation. We are grateful for your leadership, your insights, and your encouragement for the future.